Hello and welcome to Dig School, an inquiry-based cross-curricular workshop enabling young people to enjoy learning while learning new skills and new perspectives on the world around. This week in Dig School we'll be looking at History CSI, your chance to investigate an ancient crime and piece together the clues from the past. What you'll be looking to do is analysing the evidence to discover who was this person, when did they die, how did they die, why did they die, and who was to blame. And on the right here you can see the skeleton you're going to be investigating, which came from this silent, forgotten grave in this remote corner of Norfolk. You'll be acting like a crime scene investigator, piecing together the evidence. My name is Professor Carenza Lewis, and I was involved in the excavation of this skeleton. So what I want you to do first of all is have a good look at some of the most crucial evidence, the skull from this body. In the slide here, you can see on the left there's a normal human skull, and in the middle there's the skull from our excavation. Have a good look at it and see if you can spot the significant clues. Is there any evidence for damage on the skull? And do you think any of that damage results from deliberate injuries? If so, do you think there's evidence from this skull to suggest that crime might have been committed? So, what did you see? Well, you probably spotted the big hole in the skull at the top there. It's very, very obvious. And in fact, when we were doing the excavation, we could immediately see, as you can see in the close-up of the skull here, and when we looked down at the skull from the top, that a large chunk of skull had been severed, swept away. The rest of the damage you can see on the skull is the fact that there's a hole at the back and behind the eye sockets. That's just actually a natural process that happened when the skeleton was in the graves, centuries after it had been buried, probably. As you can see, the skull's been lying on its side. The lower part would be wetter because it's closer, tighter to the ground. It's in sand, it's a very acid environment. It tends to erode away the bone. So the rest of the damage you can see is actually just a natural process. That hole in the top of the skull is not natural at all. So I expect you spotted that, but there's a couple of other clues, and I wonder if you did notice those. The first clue is the fact actually that when we didn't notice this during excavation, that when we looked very carefully at the skull, what we could see was actually the whole chunk of it hadn't been swept away in one sort of scalping type blow. Actually, it was just the side where that second arrow is had been cut by a thin, sharp, heavy bladed instrument, and the rest of the skull had been taken away actually in a different procedure. We'll come back to that a little bit later. But in the meantime, there are actually two other clues as well on the skull. And they're down at the side here. They're quite easy to miss again. But when you look closely, as you can see in the close-up there, there's two more notches at the side of the skull, just sort of above and behind the ear, where the ear would have been. And these are coming in at exactly the same angle as the main cut that removed the first bit of bone from the skull. So you've got three sharp, hard blows with a sharp bladed implement, not a really heavy instrument, a quite light one but very strong. Did you have a think about what that might have been? You want to have a think about it now? It's actually a sword. The injury it's sharp and precise. If it had been an axe, a battle axe, it would have caused much more cracking across the rest of the skull. And if it had been something like a mace or a hammer, that would have smashed the skull again much more. So those injuries are very characteristic of a sword. But something like a dagger, a much shorter sword, wouldn't have been strong enough to make that injury. So we've got 3 sword injuries to our skull, one of which is really quite catastrophic, the one on the top of the head. And interestingly, when we looked again carefully in the lab, we could see from the angle of those cuts to the skull that they were made from above the victim and from behind. So we are looking at a pretty violent injury by someone who is pretty handy with a sword. But we don't know when, we don't know why, we don't know who the injury was to, and we don't know who it was by. So to answer these questions, you'll need to look at the bottom half of the first page of your workbook, because what I'm going to do now is take you through the rest of the evidence and note down everything you hear which relates to these key 6 questions. So the first one is, how was the body found? Well, actually, I'm an archaeologist. It was found during an archaeological dig. It was actually found during a dig that was carried out for a television programme, one of a long-running series called Time Team, which followed new archaeological excavations. The excavation here was in the field that you can see from the aerial photograph, and we excavated a lot of trenches, one of which revealed this skeleton. If you're interested, the Time Team is still available to watch on all 4, and there's a link there that you can go and watch the television programme afterwards if you want to. Our skeleton only turned up really quite close to the end of the dig, so it only comes in at the end of the programme actually. So what you're going to be looking at now is mostly new evidence that didn't appear in the programme because the programme was broadcast live and we didn't know most of this at that time. The next question then is, what sort of place was the body buried in? It looks like a violent injury. Was it buried in a shallow grave, hastily concealed? Well, not at all, actually. It was buried in a Christian cemetery. All the graves were orientated east-west with heads to the west. The bodies were all placed on their backs. That's classic Christian burial. And we can see, as you can see in the plan on the right of the screen here, that there were lots of other skeletons buried there as well. So our skeleton was buried in a cemetery, formally and properly, kind of as if nothing had happened. The cemetery was near a church. You can see a photograph of this from the air. It's ruined now. And the church was near a settlement which was enclosed by a large bank and ditch. You can see that marked out with the blue arrows on the aerial photograph there. And there's a reconstruction drawing of what that would have looked like at the time. And we had a good idea of what that time was because of the finds that had come from metal detectorists working on the site before we got there, and from finds we made during the excavations. And those finds indicated an Anglo-Saxon date, and they also indicated both wealth, there's a key and there's coins, and learning, those little stick-like things on the side are styli, they're Anglo-Saxon writing implements. And with those characteristics at that time, the site is most likely a Christian monastery. So our skeleton is buried inside a cemetery of a Christian monastery. It didn't stay like that. The excavation showed that actually that monastic cemetery was overlain by a house and oven, nothing apparently very religious about that at all, by 1100 AD at the latest, because the oven is that funny little thing with the holes on it on the right-hand side of the screen. And in the red circle there, we found this piece of pottery, which is Thetford ware, dating to between 850 and 1100 AD. That must have fallen into that hole after the oven went out of use, so the oven must have gone out of use by 1100 AD. Therefore, the cemetery must have gone out of use even longer ago, because it's earlier than the oven, because the oven's on top of it. And in fact, the entire site was abandoned by about 1400 AD. None of the pottery is any later than 13th century, and this is what the site looks like today. You can see the little blue balloon over the Church of St James. There's absolutely nothing anywhere around it at all, apart from King's Lynn City off to the west. So next question, what was the person like when alive? Well, when we first saw the skeleton in the grave, the kind of violent injury, said something, suggested perhaps they'd been in a battle. It was immediately very apparent that they had really heavy brow ridges, the bone ridges above the eye sockets that you can see here on the skull here. Very, very heavy. And that's a classic sign of a male skull. Males tend to have much heavier brow ridges, on average, than females do. Further examination of the skeleton when we got it back to the lab showed that they were aged about 30 to 40 when they died. They were about 5'5" in height. They were heavily built. The heavy brow ridges were matched by the rest of the skeleton. Very resilient. They nearly survived the attack, which, as we've seen, was fairly brutal. And they were Christian because they were buried in a Christian cemetery. Now, most of this was right, but the DNA analysis threw up a major surprise. In mammals, if you have 2 copies of the X chromosome, that indicates female. And that's what this skeleton had. So they weren't a male at all, they weren't a soldier, they were a woman. So what injuries had this poor female sustained? Well, we've already had a look at the head injuries, those 3 blows to the skull, all from the same direction from behind with a sword, one of which caused a severe injury to the very top of the skull. But again, when we got into the laboratory, we had a careful look over it and we found another injury in a completely different bit of the skeleton. This was on the femur, the upper end of the thigh bone, close to the hip. And it had some very distinctive injuries from a very different source. These were bite marks. Now, we initially assumed that this would probably be from something like a dog, so the attacker might have had a fierce dog with them to help sustain that attack. But when we matched up the bite marks with skulls of different sorts of animals, and we had a reference collection of these, the closest match was actually with one of these. Not a dog at all, but a badger. So this woman was bitten on the hip hard by a badger. Analysis, again, after the programme had finished, actually showed that another of the skeletons in that cemetery, this a young to middle-aged adult male, maybe about 20 to 30, also had a lot of sword injuries. They had 2 severe chops to the front of the skull and across the back. You can see the sort of slicing wound on this close-up of that skull. They had a glancing blow to the side of the left chin, which had taken away part of the lower part of the mandible. They had another injury on the right shoulder blade, 2 on the right-hand side ribs, and 1 on the rear of the right tibia. So on this skeleton, you can see these are the locations of all of the sword injuries from this individual. So clearly our woman was not the only person who'd suffered at the hands of the swordsman. So next question, when did the person die? Well, the finds from the site, I've already shown you some of those. They dated broadly to between about 600 and 1000 AD. And we've already seen that the cemetery went out of use sometime between 850 and 1100 AD because of that bit of pottery. But that's quite a wide date range. So what we wanted to do was get a more scientific date. So we got a radiocarbon date, and that showed that our woman died between 760 and 880 AD. Now that's 120 years, so it's quite a wide margin of error there. We got a radiocarbon date for the second skeleton with the sword wounds as well. And those dates came out to between 686 and 827. So again, it's a wide date range. And on average, that second skeleton's dates are a bit earlier. But it's equally possible, because there's such a wide day range and there's some overlap, that they did die at the same time. And if they did, it's likely to be between 760 and 827 AD. This, of course, immediately promotes the thought to us, what's going on in England then? Now, you could do a bit of research into this, but the main characteristic activity that is taking place in England then is Viking attacks. Certainly, that's the main activity which you might expect, the sort of frenzied attack that we've seen in these skeletons. Viking attacks are becoming more and more numerous, really from the late 700s for a century. By the time you get to 865, these Viking raiding parties are actually bringing over large armies, and in 865, for the first year, they actually overwinter. Instead of coming for summer raiding and then leaving for the winter, they actually overwinter in England. But that's the beginning of a permanent occupation of parts of England by these Viking communities. So that's when our skeleton died in terms of history, but in terms of her own lifetime, she didn't actually die immediately. When we first saw that head wound, we thought it was a catastrophic, immediately fatal injury. It didn't look possible that anyone could have survived that. But actually, again, once the skull was cleaned up in the lab and examined in much more detail, it astonishingly became evident that in fact the sword had caused the first injury, but the other sort of 3/4 of the area of bone that had been removed had actually been taken away in a surgical procedure that had sort of chiselled away to remove that section of bone. Now, the only possible reason for doing this is an attempt to save her life. It seems likely that the sword wound had damaged the skull and had probably pushed that piece of skull down against her brain. And this operation was carried out in an attempt to relieve the pressure on the brain and save her life. It seems almost unimaginable that anyone would have tried that more than 1,000 years ago, when there's no anaesthesia that we would recognise, there's no antibiotics, there's no way of controlling bleeding, for example. But they clearly did. And miraculously, she survived for a while. The bone regrowth, there's a tiny bit of bone regrowth around the edge of that massive head wound, which is why it's a little bit blurry at the edges. The skull that you can see on the right here shows what a skull looks like when it's had a plate of bone removed and the person has survived and the bone has started to grow back. On this skull, on the right, you can see there's a square scar on the bone shown by the arrows, showing where the original square cut in this case was, and everything inside of that is where the bone's grown back over. And that only happens if the person's alive. In the case of our woman, she survived perhaps a few days, maybe as much as a week, because there's just a little bit of bone regrowth, but she didn't survive any longer than that. So the final question on your sheet was, what was the cause of death? Well, we've seen the sequence of events. We've seen a sword injury, which we initially thought had killed her immediately, but didn't. We've seen a badger bite. Perhaps it was the badger bite that introduced an infection. Perhaps it was lying on the ground at a time when the badger came out to scavenge and find her. Perhaps that's what caused her perhaps to develop some infection or exposure that eventually killed her. Or perhaps it was a surgical operation. Maybe something went wrong there. Maybe that introduced an infection. But the cause of death definitely stems from that sword wound. If that sword attack hadn't happened, none of the sequential events after that would have happened. So that's the evidence. What's the story? So what you can do now that I've shown you what we know is analyse all of that evidence to try and reconstruct what happened. And remember, when you're doing this, that the ideas, your theories about what happened are different to the facts. I've given you the facts, the evidence. Those won't change, those won't be wrong unless we've made a huge mistake. Facts are not wrong. But the ideas, the theories, the suppositions, the interpretations, those can be wrong because they're really informed guesses. But you need to make those informed guesses because the evidence doesn't give you everything. We can't interview our suspect. So it's always really important when you're doing any sort of investigative inquiry is always remember the difference between your facts and your ideas. Facts can't change, but your ideas can. So on the next page of your workbook, there's 6 questions here. What you can do now is look at each of those questions and write down in the first column everything you think you even might know that answers that question. And then write down in the next question what the evidence is for why you think you might know that. Remember, this doesn't have to be definite, it just has to be your interpretation. And because it's your interpretation, in the third column, you then should write down how confident are you? On a scale of 1 to 10, would you say you're 10 out of 10, absolutely definite, or 1 out of 10, really not very sure at all? So those are the key things to think about. What do I think? Why do I think it? And how confident am I? When you're looking at this, just a few tips. Think beyond the immediate facts. Think about your wider knowledge. You can use the internet. There's a few key things that's worth thinking carefully about. Think about how badgers behave. What sort of places do they like to inhabit? How do they behave? Are they timid, aggressive? Why would one bite a human? In what circumstances could that happen? Think about how the person was hit. How would the attacker get to be above them and behind them? What's the significance about being hit from behind? How much skill will you need to get those 3 blows so close together? And think about the challenge of the surgical operation. Who exactly could have even attempted that at that time? Where would they have done it? Why would they have bothered when the injury was so severe? And then think about what was happening in England at that time. Can the attack be linked to any known historical events? So I hope you enjoy trying to puzzle that out and then trying to work out who you think might have been guilty. Part 2, I'll go through the evidence so you can see how it compares with yours. So, in part 2 of History CSI, we'll have a look at the answers. So, I don't know what answers you got. What I'm going to do is take you through each of those questions and tell you what I think, what the evidence is for that, and how confident I am about it. So the first question was, in what historical period did the person die? Well, in the 700s or 800s AD. That's the Middle Anglo-Saxon period, Late Anglo-Saxon period. It's also a period when there was a lot of Viking raiding. So from some perspectives, people might even call it the Viking period. What's the evidence for that? Well, there were the finds, of course, but the key evidence is the radiocarbon date, because that's from the skeleton. The finds didn't actually come from in the grave, because Christians tend not to be buried with things with them at all. How confident am I about this? Well, I gave this a 9 out of 10. Radiocarbon dating is a scientific technique. It's very accurate, although it's not always very precise. It has quite a wide margin, as you've seen, so it won't give an exact year. So the next question then is, where were they when they were attacked? Well, I think they were outside the monastery, probably in woodland. What's the evidence for that? Well, it's that badger bite. Badgers don't live in monasteries and they usually prefer woodland. It wouldn't have travelled very far, they don't have huge territories, they've only got relatively short little legs. So how confident am I about this? Well, 6 out of 10, I think. It is a bit of a guess. Badger behaviour is quite well known, they've been well studied, so the suggestion is worth making, but it's worth bearing in mind that, of course, our victim could have been attacked somewhere else and then dumped in the woodland. So for all of these questions, have a think about what you think. Have I missed anything you suggested? Do you disagree with any of my suggestions? And if you do, why? So you can stop this tape at any time and have a talk among yourselves. Add things in, take things out, discuss what you think the answers to these questions are. Third question then, why was the person attacked? Well, it could just have been because she was female, but I think it's because she was associated with the wealthy monastery and was killed as part of an attack on that. It may have been for both reasons. So what's the evidence? Well, she was buried in the monastery, which suggests she was connected to it. Plus she had that complex medical treatment, which suggests she was important. How confident am I about this? Well, 6 out of 10. There's no direct evidence, it's just circumstantial. Documents tell us quite a lot about the behaviour of Vikings during attacks and that they did target monasteries, but we don't have anything specific to tie that to this case. Again, what do you think? So next question, what happened during the attack? Well, I think the victim was being chased through woodland by someone on horseback when she was felled by a sword wound to the leg. She was then struck repeatedly with the sword on the head and was then probably robbed and might have had her clothes removed. She was then left for dead. So what's the evidence? This sounds very detailed perhaps. Well, the skull shows the 3 head wounds and shows they came from behind and above. The angle, the height, the fact it's from above is what suggests the attacker was on horseback. They'd be very difficult for them to be moving fast and still be at height if they weren't on a horse. The leg wound and the removal of clothing is suggested by the badger bite. Now, badgers would have been attracted by the blood to actually start biting, eating that part of the body, which suggests there was blood there, presumably from a wound. But if that had been covered with clothing, it would have been difficult for the badger to get at that bit of the body. A motive for removing the clothing could have been to look for valuables which the attackers might have hoped she'd had hidden about her person. How confident am I about this? Well, I gave it a 6 out of 10, though I might think 7 out of 10 on an optimistic day. The skull wounds are really strong evidence, but the other details are based on supposition and on naturalist knowledge about badger behaviour. We know they're omnivorous and we know they will eat carrion, dead meat. Again, what do you think? Next question, what happened after the attack? Well, I think she lay alone and unconscious in woodland for at least part of the night, but was found while she was still alive and then taken to the monastery for surgery to try and save her life. She died a few days later and was buried respectfully in a Christian cemetery. So what's the evidence? Well, badgers are timid and nocturnal. They would only come out at night, therefore she must have been there at night. Movement, either by her or by someone else with her, would have frightened the badger away. They are fairly timid. Documents tell us that the monastery would have been the only place with the skills to attempt the surgery, and the skull is evidence that this surgery was attempted and also shows us how long she lived for. And the archaeological excavation shows us that she was buried in a Christian manner in a Christian cemetery with others buried in the same way. So how confident am I about this? Well, I'm fairly confident, 9.5 perhaps out of 10. The evidence from the skull is very definite, and naturalists again tell us about badger behaviour. The bite must have happened before the operation, because if they'd taken all that trouble with the operation and then taken all the care to bury her respectfully and properly, one can't imagine that they would have left her body out for a badger to scavenge at that time. What can we say about the attackers? Well, we can go out on a little bit of a limb here perhaps, but I think there's a strong possibility they were Viking raiders, professional fighters skilled with swords, including from horseback. Their first motive was probably plundering the monastery and the people who were in it for anything valuable that could be taken away. What's the evidence? Well, there's the radiocarbon date, so we know that this person died at a time when there was a lot of Viking raiding, and they're very close to the North Sea coast where those raids were coming from. The skill of the attack, those three sword injuries on the skull placed very close together, that's difficult to do, especially from horseback, and especially when you've been chasing someone. And of course, there's the connection with the monastery. We can be fairly confident that our victim was connected with the monastery. So how confident am I about this? Would I convict a Viking raider? Well, there's no direct evidence, but documents do tell us there were a lot of Viking attacks on monasteries at that time, so they do seem the most likely culprit. The wounds are definitely from a skilled swordsman, not a casual robber. But it's important to remember that there were Anglo-Saxon armies around at these times. There was sometimes fighting between different Anglo-Saxon kingdoms, and the Anglo-Saxons were also good with swords. Again, what do you think? So then, in summary, do you think that Viking raider is guilty or not? What you can now do is work through pages 3 and 4 of your workbook to summarise your two arguments. Firstly, write down everything you think, all the arguments. If you were a lawyer in court prosecuting that Viking raider, put down all of the evidence that you'd use and the arguments, what you'd say about that evidence to try and convince a jury that that Viking raider was the guilty person. And then on the next page, imagine you're the defence lawyer trying to make the jury doubt that that Viking raider was guilty. What are those prosecution arguments and how would you refute them? How would you cast doubt on them? And remember, in an English law court today, if you have any doubt at all about whether someone is guilty, then you are obliged to acquit, to say they are not guilty. You don't have to say they're innocent, you simply say they're not guilty. Have a think about these two arguments. When you've had a chance to work through them, discuss them with each other. Some of you taking the argument to persuade the others that the Viking is guilty, others trying to put the case that they might not have been. When you've done that, imagine that you're all members of a jury. You have one vote. Are you going to vote that Viking raider guilty or not guilty based on the evidence and the arguments that you've heard presented? Remember, modern English law, if you're not sure, you must say not guilty. So, counting all the jury votes from your group, was that Viking raider convicted or acquitted? And overall, amongst all of you, what was the most important evidence? So I hope you've enjoyed that opportunity to analyse some real evidence about a real ancient death and develop some skills of critical thinking, of examining your evidence and thinking critically about it. What can I say about it? What does it really mean? What's my evidence? This is the sort of skills that are always going to be useful to you. So I hope you enjoyed this dig school and that we'll see you again for another dig school in the future. I'll just leave you with a few references. Goodbye.